Continuing with the major ways that mountains affect climate, as elevation increases, air temperature drops. So going up a mountain, you can actually visit and traverse several biomes within a relatively small geographic area. So there's places in California where you can go up to the Sierra Nevadas, say from coastal California or central California, and you can pass desert biomes, desert grasslands, woodlands, pine woodlands, spruce, fir forest, all the way up to past the tree line, which would be comparable to what we call tundra, in a relatively short drive, because you're going up in elevation and it gets colder and colder. So if you remember, precipitation, rainfall, and temperature are major factors contributing to biomes and where they're found on Earth. Secondly, mountains block the flow of cool, moist air that's coming in from the ocean. So again, considering California, here's our Pacific coast, here's our coastal ranges, Bay Area's on the coastal area. Then there's a drop to the Central Valley, and then the Sierra Nevadas, and then east of that, you're getting into like Nevada. So as the winds are coming in over the Pacific Ocean, they're relatively cool, they carry moisture. As they go up in elevation, the air temperature drops. We get abundant rainfall in the coast ranges, especially in Northern California. Then the wind that drops down has less moisture content, so the Central Valley tends to be drier. And then as the winds and the air continues to go up in elevation over the Sierra Nevadas, higher elevation, that cold temperature causes more rainfall to fall. And then the winds coming up over the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevadas are dry, cool air. So that contributes to these sometimes called high basin deserts that are east of the Sierra Nevadas. And those deserts are there because of the influence of the mountain ranges to the west of them, influencing how much or how little rainfall will actually land there. So let's look at the terrestrial ecosystems and those biomes that are grouped primarily based on and described basically mostly on vegetation type, the type of plants that can be found there. Excuse me. You notice how they're spread across the planet, usually along these lines, these latitude lines, with some exceptions, and those exceptions are usually based on landforms, like the mountain ranges here, Rocky Mountains, Sierra Nevadas, going down to South America, the Andes mountain ranges, and some of the mountain ranges in Asia, like the Tibetan high mountain ranges where Mount Everest is located. Okay? So, precipitation and temperature, again, are major factors contributing to biome distribution on Earth. So just looking at this graph, here on the bottom on the x-axis is mean precipitation, so average rainfall in centimeters, from essentially 0 up to over 400 centimeters. That's a lot of water. On the left-hand axis, this is mean temperatures, degrees Celsius, so the average temperature yearly. So notice that where there's little rainfall and it's cold, that contributes to the climatic conditions that lead to this particular biome. And that's tundra, which we'll talk about. Temperatures get warmer, but still very dry, and that's this little sliver you see here. Those are deserts. So deserts are classified primarily on how little rainfall they get, whether they're hot or relatively cold. Okay? Notice moderate temperatures, but increased rainfall, that leads to conditions where you can get grasslands. Increased rainfall, that's the main difference between here in tan and here in these shades of green. Increased rainfall. Increased rainfall, you can start to get abundant trees to build, make forests. Okay? And then a lot of rainfall and fairly warm, now we get our tropical rainforests around the world. So again, these biomes can be mapped out often based on precipitation, rainfall, and temperatures. Okay, so let's look at the tropical forests. Notice where they're located, fairly close to the equator. Temperature range fairly high, precipitation, lots of rainfall. High temperatures cause local evaporation of moisture, reaches altitude, condenses into clouds at altitude. It's colder, water vapor condenses and falls locally, as we looked at a few minutes ago. So tropical forests occur in the equatorial areas where temperatures are warm and day length is pretty consistent, 11 to 12 hours a day, year-round. That's very different from what we get up here in the northern hemisphere, in the United States, for example. The type of vegetation is primarily determined by rainfall. So even in these areas, the rainfall amounts can vary. But abundant rainfall will lead to lush tropical rainforest biome. So layered structures of these tropical rainforests provides many different habitats. I'll go back here. That provides habitats and homes for many different organisms. So the tropical rainforests are very, very diverse in terms of different species and the communities, different organisms living in association with each other. A while back when I was talking about coral reefs are very diverse habitats or biomes, and so are tropical forests, rainforests in particular, because of the many habitats that are found. Here we go. So tree tops form a closed canopy over certain areas, and they can have multiple layers of smaller trees and shrubs growing underneath what's called the understory. And sometimes that's somewhat shaded, so there's often a competition for sunlight at the forest floor. Tropical dry forests will predominate in areas with a relatively long dry season and or with relatively little rainfall. So there's places in the tropics, like in Costa Rica, where there's tropical dry forests that don't look that much different from the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas. And again, the main difference between that and a tropical rainforest is the amount of rainfall. Moving on to savanna, grasslands. Pretty warm, precipitation drops quite a bit, and fire is not rare. Fire can actually be fairly frequent, so many of the plants are fire adapted. So savannas are dominated by grasses and scattered trees. The reason there's not an abundant amount of trees is because the rainfall is fairly limited. But there's enough rainfall for abundant grasses. And if you have a lot of grass, well, you're going to have a lot of animals that are going to be specialized in eating them. So herds of herbivores are traditionally found in savannas. fairly warm year-round. Rainfall, only about 12 to 20 inches per year, with dramatic seasonal variation. Sometimes it's a very rainy, wet season, and sometimes it's a very dry season. But normally the rainfall is limiting to the point where you don't get forests. Lightning and human activity can cause fire, but historically, lightning causes fire that will burn grasses, and that's an important abiotic factor in the savanna, helping, for one thing, limit the size of larger trees, but actually contributing to the dynamic nature of these places. A lot of the world's large grazing mammals are found in these areas, and then that means their predators are also found there. A lot of zebras, different species of antelope, buffalo, lions, cheetahs, lots of interactions in these dynamic savannas. Okay, let's move to deserts, which are actually some of the newest biomes on planet Earth. And deserts are traditionally hot, but they can be freezing cold. The main contributing factor to a desert is little to almost no rainfall. So the driest of all biomes, and less than 12 inches a year of rainfall. And they can be very hot. Think of Death Valley, the Sahara Desert, but they can be relatively cold. The high deserts on the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevadas, as I mentioned, because of that rain shadow effect, those are technically deserts, even though they can freeze over during the winter. So vegetation type includes plants that are adapted to relatively low water availability. So plants that can store water, like cacti, and shrubs that have really deep root systems that can suck up any available water that may occur during the infrequent rains. So common inhabitants, snakes, lizards, things that have nice dry scaly skin, seed-eating rodents are common. And then arthropods, things with an exoskeleton like insects and scorpions, spiders. And then some of the adaptations for the plants and animals include mechanisms that are useful for conserving water. So cacti have this kind of pleated structure, and when it rains, that structure allows the cacti to swell up and expand to absorb water through the roots. So they can store water internally for times when water is really scarce. Some of the mice, like the kangaroo rat, actually never drink water. They get all their water needs from plant matter that they eat, and in particular seeds, that when they break them down metabolically, that releases metabolic water. Go back and look at cellular respiration and see where the water is released during cellular respiration processes, and they're so well adapted that that's all the water that they actually ever need to utilize or use or obtain is what's called metabolic water. Okay, let's transition to Chaparral. And I kind of made a larger picture of this map because it's really hard to see where we find Chaparral. Relatively small biomes along the Mediterranean, a bit of South Africa, a bit of the south coast of Australia, and then where we live in western coast of the United States and parts of California, we have Chaparral. So vegetation is a product of cool ocean currents producing relatively rainy winters and relatively hot, dry summers. So plants that are adapted to that sort of climatic changes, limited to these coastal areas in California and along the Mediterranean Sea. During the summer, the abundant grasses and shrubs often will burn, lightning strikes. So vegetation is adapted to periodic fires, just like the savanna vegetation. So shrubs that do burn, depending on the intensity of the fire, the surviving roots underground can grow and regenerate relatively quickly. The ash from the fire provides nutrients for regenerating plants. And actually some seeds in some plants, trees, and their seed pods, or some plants and their seed pods, they're adapted to only open, and or the seeds are adapted to only germinate after a fire. That might sound interesting, but think about it. If a fire burns out some of this understory, meaning below the trees, plant material, and kind of clears out an area, that gives an open area for seeds to fall and germinate and limits competition for resources, in particular water. So a lot of the vegetation plants in the Chaparral area are actually fire adapted and actually do well with relatively low intensity fires. The problems we have recently with intense fires is humans tend to put out fires that would naturally be occurring. So then plant matter builds up and accumulates. It dies and dries out during the summer. So there's a lot of fuel that builds up because of humans preventing naturally occurring fires. So then when a fire does happen and we can't contain it, it can be devastating. A larger fire than would naturally occur on its own. Okay, let's move on to temperate grasslands, which are pretty extensive over the planet. And they're dominated by, grasses. And then the things that eat grasses. So abundant grasses, mostly treeless, not enough moisture to support trees. And we'll continue this.